two different ends of the spectrum. You have a lot of people that think of, let's say, the ego as being very self-centered, being very narcissistic. On the other end of the spectrum, you have a desire for complete ego death,
Yeah.
and then sitting, finding that seat of the soul and sitting in that awareness. But I would think there would be need of an emergence of the two. Can you sit in that level of awareness while still utilizing the ego to explore and interact in this realm? I mean, to not completely do away with it and disregard yourself as having, and I am Steve and you are Rob, but still pulling back and utilizing it. Is that possible?
Question and an insight there. It actually reminds me of a specific part in Eric Neumann's book, The Origins and History of Consciousness. And this is a somewhat obscure book, but it's also a really awesome book. It's famously Jung read it and said, "I wish I wrote this book." So it covers a really, really interesting twist that I think almost no one else talks about or maybe understands in the fields of psychology that put a lot of emphasis on the ego and ego development. And so I'll read a little bit of this here. Whereas in the first half of life, the central position of the ego does not allow the workings of centrovision to come into consciousness, the middle period is characterized by decisive change of personality. Centroversion becomes conscious. The ego is exposed to somewhat painful process, which, starting in the unconscious, permeates the entire personality. So this psychological mutation with its symptomology and symbolism, Jung has described as the individuation process. We can say that with the phenomenon of the second half of life, the personal development of centroversion enters upon a second phase, whereas where its initial phase led to the development of the ego and to the differentiation of the psychic system. Its second phase brings the development of the self and the integration of that system. But although the transformation process runs in the opposite direction to the development which took place during the first half of life, the ego and consciousness are not disintegrated. On the contrary, there is an expansion of consciousness brought about by the ego reflecting upon itself. It is as though the ego were restored to its original position. It emerges from its monomaniac self-obsession and becomes once more the vehicle of totality function. So this is an amazing idea. And basically, what he's talking about here is he's trying to describe what he believes is a true process and the real reality of what happens. But what he has found there and described is essentially the solution to the immense trap of overcoming or getting rid of your ego. And there's another place in the book that says a little bit different particulars, but basically he talks about it's very awesome play on the whole issue because he describes the ego as a special complex. And you might think that's the worst thing you could do with the ego because the ego wants to be special. But he's also showing that by recognizing this and giving it what it wants, you actually disarm it in a way. So the ego is not to be destroyed, overcome, or annihilated, because all that leads to, as hopefully a lot of people are aware, is just destroying the thing over there. I mean, like, I defeated my ego, and now you have a big ego about defeating your ego.
Right.
But the point that he's making is that and it ties into this book, the ego is actually a good, useful, and purposeful creation that has the inbuilt potential and mechanisms for its own um, humbling. So while the ego gets all the bad name, and rightfully so, for being reactive and protective and blinding you to things and all that sort of stuff, it is also, according to his study and the case he makes, the only complex that actually has the capacity to grow and change and integrate more things. All other complexes are static, while the ego um, has the potential for growth. And so, what he described there at the end of that quote was when you turn to the second phase of life and you pursue a relationship with the self, the ego plays a part in that and is involved in the process. And by being included and involved in the process and not fought against, it actually is calmed and it essentially gets all that it would want. And it becomes a willing participant in it. And then you get to a essentially what he's saying there at the end is you get to a new level of ego. The ego is the totality of function, but once it's incorporated the self within it, then it becomes a whole different animal. It becomes essentially an enlightened ego. And I think this is just an astounding discovery. The whole book is amazing. But that whole bit, I think, is the solution to the modern conception of chasing ego death and conquering your ego and the obsession of psychology that it all brings in is just because that's just going to be a never ending cycle. But when you realize that this is actually an intelligently designed system that is supposed to be functional, not dysfunctional, and that the ego has certain valuable functions that are there for that reason, then you sort of get everything that you could want in this package. You still got your ego and whatnot, but you come into relationship with something transcendent. He says a couple pages later there, the ego, something like the ego understands that it has immortality in itself, but that it is itself mortal, something like that. And then I think that very well ties in with um, the Christian view that comes about where there's like you've got the life of Christ within you, and after death you're destined in some way for the life of Christ and being a part of infinite divine life, but you're also mortal and you're not it's not the Eastern annihilation of the self and through the annihilation of the self become the infinite self. So very insightful book, very helpful, I think, and cool that we got to tie it in. So I think that the point there, and it was said in somewhat technical language, but essentially the point he was making, and this is why it's so radical, is that really the ego is the only complex, and by complex I mean aut semi-autonomous psychological system. So you might also say personality in that sense. Um, the ego is the only complex that actually has the capability of humility. And I know that strikes us as weird because we always use ego to mean not humble, but it doesn't mean that all egos are humble. It means that the ego has the capacity to become humble and let's say it this way: the ego has the capacity to survive being humbled, and that also is something that should be hopefully obvious to the ego death crowd, because once your ego died, did you no longer have an ego?
Right.
No, your ego survived the ego death. So ego as a principle is something that is capable of transcending and jumping these levels. And that creates the problem that we were talking about, but it also is the solution at the same time. And the nature of the ego as it, though, just the way that I would put it, as the ego becomes, integrates the um, allegiance to truth and honesty and integrity, then when it finally meets the self, it knows what that means. It has met something that is truly superior and should be superior to it. It is something that it is willing to be. It recognizes the fight is uh, not winnable because the self precedes the ego and the ego emanates from the self.
So the
So
self, I don't mean to interrupt. So the self is a more developed layer of consciousness. That is the expanded person. So when we could you go into depth a little bit more then is that awareness behind the I am? Is that what the self is?
um, possibly it depends on how you define each of those layers. And I think we would all have our own conception of what we mean by those words, but the the self is, I think, the most ready way to understand it is the popular conception, though again, I don't think it's technically theologically super sound, but it reflects something that's true and that we're aware of, is the idea of the divine spark. So
Yeah.
there's an aspect of God's life that lives within us and underlies everything that we are and gives us its life freely, allowing us to be who we are. It's not there to conquer us. It's actually on our side and wants us to exist as, um, you might say, secondary beings. And so it's not, in some ways, it's not identical with, so it's not the Godhead. The self is um, it's like the spark. So it's from the Godhead. It's that infinite within. Each piece of infinite is infinite, so it's still infinite, but it's not the same thing as the Godhead. Again, we're in mystical territory, so systematically um, nailing it all down is an illusion, but something like that. The self is a piece of divinity.
Yeah.
And so and the ego, on that point, the ego is not a corruption. It is not a aberration. It is
Tool.
corruptible,
Yeah,
and it
it's
can,
a tool.
yeah. So given that it is purposefully made, given that it is not a corruption in itself, when it recognizes the self, it recognizes its true master, and it is at peace with being in orbit around that. And so then you have, that's, I would say, that's the integration of the ego and the self, is the ego orbiting the self and fighting against its tendency to exit that orbit and go into orbit, something else that it's interested in. And then what I think that paragraph that I read was talking about is that, and this is somewhat contradicting, so I could be wrong. It could be just also contradicting because it's a mystical thing. But I would say what he's talking about there is that then the totality of the functional personality becomes the solar system, if you might think about it that way. It is both the self and the ego orbiting the self. And the totality of the personality is that whole system. And so in a sense, your ego is no longer the little orbiting bit, the because the ego is a functional description of um, your standpoint and your total integrating function that actually becomes something that is both divine and immortal and uh, sinful and mortal at the same time.
So it's that tool, it's that ability, it's that inflection point where you're able to interface with the reality, and at that point, that ego, you do have that free will to choose, more divinative, more actions that align with God or more sinful behavior. But that's where that fork in the road is, right? Peeling back, you get into your higher self, and the proper integration of the ego into that higher self is through relinquishing things that, I guess, the ego or that your identity really holds on, that wants to hold on to, like a child holds on to a blanket. So a lot of so I'll bring into example, like letting go of a specific addiction, right, where your flesh body, your material, your materia wants to consume, it wants to integrate. Oh, I want this external substance within me and feel what it's like. I want to bond with it. So by relinquishing all of that, whether it be lustful behavior, it's, you're addicted to, food, you're addicted to drugs, whatever the case may be, you start breaking those down, and you go through those dark nights of the soul of like, well, if I don't have this, then what am I? If I'm not this, then what am I? And I think the more that you break those downs of, okay, well, I'm not this, the more integrated then you become with that higher self. It's like, well, okay, well, if I'm not a drug addict, if I'm not, this player, if I'm not this glutton of sorts, if I'm not this, and it could be even good. I mean, you're letting go, okay, well, if I'm not this basketball star, if I'm not this, then what am I? And then the more you go through that process of breaking that onion down, I think that the more integrated you become. Um, because a lot of it is just acting out specific roles here, right? Well, I'm the worker, so I go to work, or I'm the consumer, so I consume. But you break that down, and you're able to then integrate further with that awareness behind. You realize that your identity, that the ego is a tool that you work through to then, in an ideal sense, if you're a child of God and a follower of Christ, you use your ego, you use that to be a projector of the light of God into this realm,
Yep. And
right?
the ego in its proper function, it can't integrate uh, in the sense of conquering and swallowing. It can't integrate the self, but it can and it does integrate other complexes. It opens itself up and absorbs those complexes. And so what you're talking about is the um, ejection of complexes that are ultimately not going to uh, be good for it. But insofar as there are complexes that can be an expression of good, the ego is sort of the cap of those and integrates all of them underneath it and can at any time work through that basketball, whatever it may be, um, reading, science. That is the proper place of the ego to be in relation to those. And then this all requires, I would say, because you'd say, well, that sounds nice, but it's not. When you experience and go through it, it's not a simple process of like, oh yes, you leave, um, and it requires on every level, I would say, a awakening to the good,
Hmm.
so that there is real good to be pursued, and that's how the ego would come to um, accept into itself and make its own a drive towards truth, honesty, um, justice, goodness, temperance, all that sort of stuff. So and then you were talking about addictions, and there's a book. It's called War of the Gods in Addiction, I believe. I can't remember the author's name. It's somewhere over there, but I won't take the time to look at it. Um, and he makes a very interesting case through the Jungian lens, not as an inherent religious person himself, but he makes the case that when someone is in the grips of something that is truly an addiction, right? Not just a compelling complex for them. It's a subjective difference, but he makes the case that there is what you might call true addiction. When someone is within the grip of true addiction, according to him, the only way to break out of that is a encounter with transcendent goodness. Because he says that the addiction complex is the manifestation of transcendent evil. And in that sense, it is greater than you and greater than your power to conquer. And therefore, it can only be conquered by an experience of transcendent goodness. And he puts this all in Jungian terms. And I'm sure he obliquely recognizes the Christian implications, but he doesn't go to the point of saying, and therefore I became a Christian. But I think that's an illustrative case of the extreme of, and I think he's right. But I think it's also true of each case. Not that you need the same level of intervention to break free, but you do need that external impulse of like, oh wait, there is actually uh, things out there that are good and, for lack of a better word, eternal and eternally good that I am. Your ego can say, I must recognize those and I must pursue those, right? Because it recognizes that those things are truly good and truly worth pursuing. And so then once you have that recognition, then that's when your ego can become a vehicle that moves towards the goodness. It doesn't just inherently have a sorting system under its own power. And it's not, an enlightened calculator by itself. You have to have that experience of goodness to attract it and to convince it to um, want to save itself by becoming part of the kingdom of goodness, you might say. I mean, I think that is the story.